The day started out like any other here in Houston. The weather reports called for some heavy rain, but that's not unusual for this time of year. We get big storms rolling through now and then, but none of us were prepared for what was about to happen. The rain started coming down hard that morning. I mean, really hard. The kind of hard rain that makes you soaked just running from your front door to the car. I was about to head to work when my neighbor called me saying the bay behind our houses was overflowing its banks. That's when I realized this was no ordinary storm. Within an hour, the water was already up to my knees in the street, and it just kept rising, fast. The water was brown, debris floating by everywhere. The power went out right around then, and it suddenly got very quiet. No more TV or radio to tell us what was happening outside. From the second floor, I could see water covering the entire neighborhood and still rising. It looked like a massive lake extending for miles. Then I heard screaming and saw my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jones, trapped in her one-story house with water up to her chest. Me and a few others raced over to help her, wading through water up to our necks. We smashed a window and lifted her out, just as the water reached her ceiling. She was shaking with fear, but we got her out just in time. I can't imagine what would have happened if we had gotten there any later. As night fell, houses started collapsing from the rushing water. The sound of their foundations giving way was almost as terrifying as watching whole homes get swept away in the churning currents. We had to evacuate our house, too, once the water reached the second floor. We packed what we could fit in backpacks and waded over to a nearby elevated freeway that was still above water. There were hundreds of other people already stranded there. You started seeing people in boats going around rescuing folks from rooftops and blocked roads. Local guys with big Forks 4 trucks would pull up right through the water and load people up to get them somewhere dry. People were so grateful for the help. When the sun rose the next day, the full impact of the damage was visible everywhere. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed, filled with debris and overturned cars. The water stank terribly from sewage and chemicals. It was a war zone. 80 of the city was underwater, with some areas getting as much as 5 feet of flooding. When the Corps of Engineers opened the spillway, flooded homes got even worse. People were trapped for days with water and snakes coming in. Can you imagine how terrifying that must have been? They estimate around 150 people died in the storm. Hundreds more lost their homes and everything they owned. A whole city left utterly devastated. My family and I stayed with relatives farther north until we could return. When we came back to survey the damage, I was in shock. There was mold climbing up the walls. The carpets were filled with mud and the furniture ruined. Such painful devastation. But we endured. We helped gut houses and rip out wet drywall. Crews of volunteers came from all over the country to assist with the recovery. Slowly but surely, our community came back. It took years to rebuild. Even today, the effects still linger in damaged buildings, lost heirlooms, and trauma. When it floods now, the memories and fears return for so many folks. But Houston is resilient. We survived the worst storm on record, and we'll continue moving forward no matter what comes our way. How could any of us forget those terrible days? Entire communities changed forever in just a few hours of raging floodwaters. The awful sounds of houses crashing apart. People fleeing for their lives on crowded freeways. Helicopters and rescue boats going day and night to save stranded families. I can close my eyes and still see it like yesterday. We tell ourselves it's just weather, that we can't control it or predict it. Maybe so. But when you've lost relatives and neighbors, everything you own washed away by rising waters, it feels like a lot more than just weather. It feels personal, like the very skies have turned against you. I remember my brother calling me, panicking that floodwaters were coming into the house where he lived with my elderly mom. She was on oxygen and couldn't move very well. He didn't know how they would get out. By the time I got there, the whole street was already underwater. It was pouring rain, and the current was shockingly fast. We yelled for neighbors to help us and frantically got my mom into an inflatable boat. Water was already inside the house. My brother slipped and went under the water as we tried to get to safety. For a few terrifying moments I couldn't find him in the dark water. Thank God he surfaced, but we feared he might be swept away. Somehow, we all made it to a sheltered, elevated area. Watching my childhood home disappear under the rising tide was heartbreaking. Everything my parents had worked for, all our memories, gone in an instant. My mom passed away a few months later, and I can't help feeling like she never recovered from the shock of it all. Losing her home and everything she owned was just too much at her age. It pains me to think about. Of course, our story is far from the only one. So many suffered during those terrible days of endless rain and flooding. Families seeking shelter on rooftops, kids and the elderly rescued from nursing homes filling with water, people trapped in attics or desperately waving out windows for help. I'll never forget the images they showed on the news of an elderly man in a wheelchair left abandoned and drowned at a nursing home. It seemed unthinkable that no one had come to rescue him.
Stories like that really shake your faith.